Sebastian.
Hi, Rosemary. How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm good. Just listen, I'm going to just take a little 2 minutes to introduce you, and then you can go ahead with your presentation.
Okay,
Okay with that?
that's fine.
Thank you very
And
much for being here.
Are live. Excellent, excellent.
We are live?
We are live. People are starting to join us. They're coming in fast and furious. If only, keynote halls were able to get people in as quick as Zoom can get us in here. So far, about 150 and climbing. So welcome all of you joining us. We'll wait a few minutes to make sure everyone gets in here. Excellent, excellent. If you joined us in the last session, you'll know there's the chat there. If you want to post something in there, let us know where you're from. By all means, go ahead. Still we've got about just under 400 people here so far. Good morning from Concordia, Châteauguay, Sherbrooke. This is great.
Good.
Excellent. So just under 400. Starting to slow down a little bit. And also, I guess, just so you know, those of you posting in the chat, you've got two options. There's a drop down there. You can post just to the panelists, or you can also post to the panelists and the attendees. So then everybody gets to see your message and see where you're from. So welcome all of you, and thank you for telling us where you're joining us from. Got about 410 people here. And still climbing, so we might wait just another couple seconds or so. All right, they seem to be coming a little bit slower now, I think. Sebastian, should we go ahead and get started?
I'm ready.
Let's do it.
So welcome everyone, good morning. And for those who have not connected to the first presentation with Ailey Wickenheiser this morning, welcome to our convention. As you all know, we have decided to go virtual this year because of the pandemic. We did adapt, and also some course of events during the pandemic led us to choose certain presentations, to offer certain presentations that were relevant. And today's presentation with Rosemary Sadlier is one of those. As you all know, during the pandemic, the brutal murder of George Floyd on May 25th triggered a huge protest movement across the US that went beyond the borders of the US, across the world, and rightly so. This movement that was against racism and discrimination is requiring from all of us an in-depth reflection and introspection about this extremely important societal issue that keeps reoccurring. And we hope that this present movement will put an end to these events, but we're seeing them. We have seen them in Quebec recently with Indigenous people. So it really does require a deep reflection. As educators, we have an extremely important role to play in educating our youth. As educators, we also have this reflection to make about how to address those issues in the classroom. And certainly, one of the purposes of this presentation is to help us guide through and guide us through this process. We invited Rosemary, who accepted back in the spring to do a video blog with us that was extremely interesting and sought for by a lot of you guys. We invited her because she is a world-renowned social justice advocate, researcher, writer, consultant and international speaker on Black history, anti-racism, as well as women's issues. I want to thank her for accepting the invitation and to present to all of us today at our convention and help us through this very important reflection and process. So without further ado, I'll leave it to Rosemary. And again, thank you for being here, and enjoy the presentation.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sebastian. And thank you to QPAT for inviting me to be part of this very important conference today. As you know, this is Vision 2020, and hopefully we'll get through a few things today. I also, just before I forget, I do have a resource that I'm going to make available to Emily with QPAT, so that you are able then to follow up with some of the ideas that I'm going to be providing you with. And there's also a special, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But COVID-19, this past year has been highly challenging for us all. The many real fears, the many real hardships due to the restrictions, the last minute delays, the personal protective equipment. Thank God I don't have to wear that today. But I would also say that the challenge that it has provided us is in the time it gave us in our forced isolation to consider what is important, to wonder about what you need to know, to be mindful about how to protect yourself, your health, your mental health, and even your community's health. Then the world witnessed the public execution of a Black man named George Floyd. Maybe at another time when we are not so rushed and engaged in our demanding jobs and social situations, we might feel bad for a moment, but quickly be drawn into dealing with our responsibilities. This time, however, it was different. I think that for those who've been aware of these types of acts of violence, it was a time for action. I also think that for those who may not have been as closely connected, that now it was impossible not to see the acts of discrimination, the racially motivated harm, the active inequities in our society. I say this because the George Floyd incident was closely timed to the Regis Korchinski-Paquette curious death in the presence of the police. Another woman, Breonna Taylor, killed as she slept innocently in her own home. Or Joyce Echaquan, being racially abused as she lay dying in hospital. The list goes on. It is no longer seen as single bad actors perpetuating these deaths. As people in general were isolating, they again had to wonder, what is important in terms of how we are with each other? How those entrusted with our well-being are behaving about race and how we should treat others. We had to consider what we need to know about racism. We need to be mindful about how to be better, how to take actions toward not just a clearer future, the 2020 vision, but how to begin to take on those actions and what those actions need to be. Actions towards change, actions towards social justice, actions towards freedom. So, I love to check what has happened on a date. Every day I enjoyed going through that. And, you know, we see Queen's University, John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. But the timeline issues are examples. They all took place on this date in history. Yes, that's what makes them common. But they've all impacted our lives by people acting on their vision of what would help to constitute freedom. Queen's University continues to exist due to a Black man. The slavery that John Brown opposed would not end for another 4 years. The birth control begun and its connection to both sexual freedom and eugenics, or even selective breeding, and continues to be challenged by the politically religious right. The athletes who protested conditions for Black Americans, raising awareness, but being ostracized, Human rights continue to be discussed. Apartheid finally ended, but many legacies continue, and Black issues are still making their way to the political agenda. Little nostalgia here. I wasn't in school when it looked like that, trust me. But I want to shift the focus to myself for a moment in order to share with you a little bit of my lived experience. I was born in Toronto and educated in the public system. We were the only Black family in our neighborhood, and I was the only Black child in my school and therefore in most of my classes. However, I came to school knowing what the stereotypes were about people who looked like me. I knew from the institutions, cultural representations, media, school textbooks, movies, advertising, dominant discourses, etc. I knew that we were supposed to be less intelligent, more athletic, highly promiscuous, less beautiful, inarticulate, dishonest, lazy, dirty, and to top it off, having a penchant for watermelon. So as a 5-year-old, a 6-year-old, a 7-year-old, where did I learn who I was supposed to be in the eyes of the world? I learned this through what media was available and in class. Let me say that I was fortunate to have had some wonderful teachers, really, truly, people who affirmed me in my skills, who encouraged my potential. However, this was in a context where there was no representation and in a setting where prejudicial events still took place. I recall having a teacher, while discussing First Nations, tell the entire class to turn around and look at me, Rosemary, because she was the color of the Indians. This treatment did not consider my needs or my reality, but rather the interests of the majority. I was advised that I ought not to go to university and that I should be a secretary, although my fellow classmates with grades as good as mine were advised differently towards university. I clearly didn't pay any attention to that advice. In high school, I never participated in the fundraisers that used slave auctions. We were also being taught that all Black people were inferior, had smaller brain capacities. Yet there I sat with a rather large cranium, having to listen to this and somehow negotiate what I knew to be true with what was being offered as truth. Basically, I found myself feeling invisible, and I suspect it affected my self-esteem. I never saw myself reflected in a positive way generally, but specifically not in school. What, Black people were not even a part of Canada? Apparently, we came to roost and all returned to the United States after the Civil War. So I was not only invisible, I was not here. I did not exist. I was incredibly lucky that both of my parents had experience growing up in Canada. I was lucky to have been encouraged to have pride in being a Black person. I came to understand that things are not always as they seem. And I was blessed by my attendance at a Black church where I saw people who looked like me, and the wide variety of looks, skin tones, their beauty, the music, the competence. I knew we were here. I knew we had contributed. Both of my parents are Black. My mother, the descendant of those who came to Southern Ontario on the Underground Railroad and remained, building up communities, churches, schools, and owning property. My father was a descendant of the Black loyalists. Actually, he is a descendant of all of the first waves of migration of Africans to Canada. The Black loyalists, the late loyalists, and the refugees of the War of 1812. I was certainly familiar with my mother's Ontario heritage and some family members and the places they lived. But it was not until I was married and had 2 children, I have 3 now, that I was able to visit New Brunswick. It was sobering. Sobering to see what Black people had, to see the beautiful affluent community of Rothsay, and then to see the much less affluent areas of Willow Grove, Loch Lomond, and Elm Hill, or what remains of them. How had these 2 groups developed so differently? How is it that they worked so hard, but had so much that was so different? How is it that they were both in the same vicinity for the same number of generations, yet did not have comparable lifestyles? Many incidents later took place in relation to my children. The time I took my oldest out for Halloween, it's getting to be Halloween right now, right? And a neighbor demanded to know if we lived in the neighborhood before she would shell out. Or my oldest being the only one in her class not invited to a friend's birthday party because there were not enough chairs. Or the white neighbor who I thought was a family friend, who called me over to her home early one morning and asked me if I noticed anything. It turned out her SUV had been stolen, and she assumed I had done it, or that I would know something about it. She was a teacher, and she later went on to be a principal in the TDSB. I've shared some of my personal experiences with you in an effort to demonstrate how challenging it was to be the only Black child in my school setting, how challenging it is to be an adult interacting with others, and how disappointing it was to identify a family friend, a neighbor, a home where I had allowed my kids to have play dates, who clearly had views about people of African descent which were toxic. I have shared this with you because if not for the luck of having parents who had experienced this society, who came from generations of knowing what to expect, who had coping skills they could model and resilience, I was very fortunate. Had my own family or my experiences within the Black community not been there, what might have happened? Where would I get that information? I share this with you because I could have turned out differently had I not had a family so connected. This is not the case for many Black Canadians now. There was harm caused by not talking about race and racism, and I have shared this with you because I wanted you to know, to be reminded about the harm that racism causes people, regular people who happen to be Black. I have been harmed, my parents, their parents have been harmed, my children have been harmed. This moment in our history is an ideal time to deal with the harm caused and to prevent further harm from happening. It is time to heal the harm. And as Sebastian's indicated, educators have an obligation to confront the harm of racism. That is why we must commit to becoming anti-racist educators and to preparing our young people to be anti-racist too. You are ideally placed to influence the changes that could make a difference and to open up those brave conversations and support the systemic changes that can help. Let me just briefly share with you some of the things I have done to make a difference. hopefully to inspire you to do something. It's your students as well. As I outlined, my own lived experience combined with my passion to make things better led me to join the Ontario Black History Society, and building on what many others had done, from Carter G. Woodson's launch of Negro History Week in 1926 through to the efforts of the Canadian Negro Women's Association and the first celebration of Black History Month in the 1950s, onto the first formal proclamation for February as Black History Month secured by Daniel G. Hill and many others with the OBHS. However, when I became president in 1993, a wonderful unpaid position, I quickly discovered there was a bit of a hiccup, and I was aware that it was possible that there could be no Black History Month because there had been a failure to request it from the city. I quickly secured a permanent annual automatic proclamation for February as Black History Month, and realizing how important this was, sought one from the province of Ontario, from every province in Canada, and then went to members of Parliament to have it done federally. It landed with Jean Augustine, and we were able to secure a national declaration of February as Black History Month. 2021 will mark the 25th anniversary of this very first national celebration. And I really hoped that with this encouragement coming from all levels of government, more Black history would be included in our curriculum. More would be available in our schools from K to 12. And that with greater information would be improved race relations. I was both right and wrong, however. I did not know that, and I remained hopeful. I have created curriculum units and written books on Black history. I began to work on other commemorations, including August 1st as Emancipation Day, the date when slavery, yes, there was slavery, in this country ended. I was successful with the City of Toronto, Metro Toronto, City of Ottawa, and the province of Ontario. It has gone to second reading on 3 separate occasions with the federal government, and was most recently interrupted by COVID-19. So I'm very hopeful that in the coming weeks, we will see this happen. And certainly as a class project, get your students to write a letter of support saying that we think this is important and we want to see this happen. Why? Because it opens up the discussions about a hidden part of our history, a history that includes slavery in Canada. I've been honored by Ontario with the Order of Ontario. I'm a fellow of the Ontario College of Teachers, and I was among the first to be identified as a global defender of human rights by the Canadian Teachers Federation and the Robert F. Kennedy Center in New York. I have shared this because Quebec, because Canada never was a white country, but rather a country inhabited by First Nations, settled by Africans, free and enslaved, visited by Vikings, the Basque, Portuguese, Chinese, as well as being colonized by the French and English, with later immigration from other European countries. Black history does not begin in Canada, it begins in Africa, and it's important for us to remember that prior to the enslavement of Africans, Africa was flourishing. There were several great kingdoms in Africa that existed before enslavement. Egypt was one of the major civilizations of Africa and flourished between 1550 and 590 BC, where the calendar was invented. A form of writing, as we know, called the hieroglyphics, was created. It's also the place where the Great Sphinx and the pyramids are located. Between 3000 and 1000 BC, I think, the Nubian civilization, which included the communities of Kush and Meroe, was primarily focused on mining iron or gold. The Nubians developed a writing system, which is the second oldest in Africa. Another one is the Stone City of the South, or the Zimbabwean civilization, where they worked with the great Swahili speakers on the coast, trading in gold from 1100 to 1400 AD. And they built monuments such as the Great Enclosure Wall from granite around the 2nd or 3rd century AD. And in fact, much of the gold that was circulating through Europe came from this area. The Ghana Empire was well known for its trade in ivory and gold and was a center of learning, including Sankore University in Timbuktu, that had a library containing, wait for it, 400,000 to 700,000 items. And of course, the Songhai Empire exceeded the achievements of Ghana and Mali. Once this last great empire fell, new kingdoms took their place, including the Wolof, Hausa, or Benin. There indeed were real Wakandas, places of learning, wealth, and excellence. However, the first named African to arrive in Canada was a free translator who was familiar with the language of the First Nations and was with the voyage of Samuel de Champlain because he could speak the language of the First Nations. We believe that he had been in Canada before. However, Canada is founded on the colonization of First Nations, the further development created through the transatlantic slave trade. And it is because we had this trade that we have the ongoing disparities between and among people in Canada, where people who were white had certain privileges by virtue of being white, and people who were non-white were denied access to those same privileges by virtue of being Black. White people were just people, and their experience became what is considered normal. Efforts to maintain white supremacy were interwoven in all aspects of our society, from the justice system through to the educational system, to keep the definition a means of maintaining privilege for some. So for example, privilege is not simply a matter of hard work and virtue. If you work hard, you'll get there, because you can work hard and still not get there if you are not white. If people are not making it, there may be no consideration of some of the historical inequalities. To be clear, despite the first named African being a free man, the first enslaved African came into Canada under the French regime in 1628. A young boy captured in Madagascar, he, Olivier le Jeune, spent his life enslaved even though he was converted to Catholicism. Slavery would continue in Canada with the British until it finally was abolished, effective in 1834. Slavery was in Canada for about 200 years. 200 years, and actually included First Nations or Panis as well. You may have heard of the story of the history of Marie-Joseph Angelique, who sought her freedom in Montreal, and in the process caused a fire which burned down much of what stood there, destroying homes, warehouses, shops, a hospital, and a convent. She was tortured and killed in June 1734. A play that was created about Angelique had the director wondering, what is it about Quebec and Canada which feeds the denial of our sordid history of oppression? And I think that that's a very important question for us to be asking. It's critically important that our kids begin to learn about issues of race and equity early. High school, university, it's too late already. They need to learn early in an age-appropriate manner so that they can begin to develop their own awareness of injustice and how to address it. Clearly, there is much more to Black history in the world and Black history in Canada, and I would encourage you to find out more in order to have the missing pieces of Canadian history. This missing history includes slavery and segregation, which have had rippling effects to the present day. Following slavery, Black people were left with low-paid and low-status positions, such as cleaners, shoe shiners, domestic workers, busboys, and water boys. A few prospered while running their own businesses, and tradesmen often found their skills in demand. Some Blacks were also employed on the steamboats and in canal building, but the transportation of goods and people over water soon gave way to the lure of the railways by the 1870s. The emergence of an English-speaking working-class Black community in Little Burgundy, for example, is directly linked to the history of Canadian railways, or railroads, and the sleeping car porters. While railway industries generated enormous wealth for the owners, much of the success relied on low-wage Black labor. Black people with Canadian, American, or Caribbean roots had to negotiate life with segregated housing and the denial of services at many businesses in Quebec. Not subject to prohibition, Montreal, for example, thrived as a center for jazz, giving visiting African Americans the sense that there was no discrimination because people seemed to be able to go anywhere without restrictions. But that truly was not the case. And in the 1950s and the 1960s, the generational Black residents from that grouping, there were only 3 in university. What accounts for that? Racism still exists in our society because it is interwoven in every element of our society. It is possible to be a good person, to be a nice person, and at the very same time, be supporting inequity or holding on to ideas about other people that are different from you, which may be incorrect and ultimately racist. Another part to that, I think, is that we're all clear about how incredibly harmful the murder of George Floyd was. But I think that we sometimes think that, sorry, I'm reading ahead here, that the other levels of negative treatments are somehow not as bad. It's still all under the same rubric. By choosing not to act to address racist ideas, as Martin Luther King once said, we, in the end, will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. Silence, failure to act, is racism too. We are all responsible for perpetuating or transforming our society. My slides are out of sync here, so just give me a minute. Okay. So let's move on, thank you. Let's move on to the Quebec population a bit. What we know, okay, let me just move ahead here. Startling about Toronto, just catch up a bit. Okay, so Quebec has the 2nd largest Black population. Who knew that, eh? With 26.6% of Canada's total Black population. I didn't realize that until I came across this statistic. It's quite high. In 20 years, the Black population has more than doubled in size in this province, going from 131,000 in 1996 to 319,000 in 2016. That's a lot. The Black population is increasing and changing, and they will settle in places such as Ottawa-Gatineau, Moncton. The vast majority, of course, are moving into main large cities, urban areas. In 2016, 95% of Black people lived in large cities, compared with 71% of the country's total population. Ottawa and Gatineau had the fastest growing Black population in the country between 1996 and 2016. So this is a lot of new ideas for you to be dealing with, but you do have to deal with it. When considering the two official languages of Canada, the Black population with French as their first official language spoken represents 81.1%, while the share of those with English as their first official language spoken was 18.1%. But don't be misled by those numbers, because people can switch out of French if they don't see themselves being represented in the French community. They will switch to English. Certainly my cousins did. They will switch to English because that they will have greater access to the cultural representation in English Canada and the American situation. Okay. Black Canadians tend to be in a tend to have lower income status. They tend to be more highly unemployed, and they also are experiencing other challenges that I would like to just go on to right now. One study had Black students reflecting on their experience, and it's hard to envision what violence is, but what they said was that the violence of the educational system was the violence that was the most problematic for them. It was teachers who did not believe in them, who stereotyped them, who over-disciplined or over-punished them, and who constructed possibilities for them that were different from the possibilities for other children. In other words, assuming the worst and making that a self-fulfilling prophecy. And what does that mean in terms of newcomers to the school system? If you, depending on your point of view, depending on how you do assessments, depending on other policies in place in your school, how is it that in Quebec, students with Caribbean backgrounds are 3 times more likely to be identified as needing special education than other students? Some people feel, there we go. Some people feel that Black children are not even conceived of as children, and that they're actually seen as quite very problematic students. Where do they have most of their problems? Where do they feel the most outed, negatively treated? In the street, in school. So we are the ones that are connected to schools. We are the ones that have to deal with that, because not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And that's a famous quote by James Baldwin. So what do we do? Big problem. What do we do? And why do we do it? I think that we do it because it's not just because it's our job. We do it because hopefully we have a vision for a better society where we all can succeed and do well. And these are some of the issues that can come up, little things, the small things that are just a bit annoying, the microaggressions. But then we have, at some point in time, you might want to look at this kind of a chart and just see that there are certain types of behaviors that are annoying, inappropriate. And then of course there is another level that is much more damaging, all the way to something such as the murder of George Floyd. Something has come up recently called white fragility. I just want to mention that a bit. It's become popular recently. It was introduced by Robin DiAngelo. And in her book called White Fragility, she claims that the social environment protects and insulates white people, from race-based stress. And I think that there's something to that. If you've grown up, or if you work in, or if the only people you know happen to look like you and you are white, you have been insulated from having to think about it. It hasn't been something that you've had to deal with. You haven't had to feel uncomfortable. You haven't ever been in a situation, perhaps, where you're the only one that looks like you. And from that position of privilege, not privilege because you're affluent, privilege because you are able to negotiate the world on your own terms without question, is a level of comfort. And I get that, and I think we all get that. So it leads to expectations of racial comfort and an inability to deal with racial stress. Now that's where I'm not so sure I agree. We all are evolving. We all are learning. And I think that we can deal with racial stress. Black people deal with racial stress. We find a way. Everybody can deal with it. It may not make you feel good in the process, but we can all deal with it. So that when a white person encounters stress, they become at the very least defensive, and at the very most, they might become angry. And there's a whole series of things that she goes through in her book about what people need to do and how they might need to do it. But here's the problem. If you are, it's a fascinating book. But I think that what could happen, not necessarily, but what could happen, is that people could become stuck in endless self-reflection about white privilege, about feeling guilty, about not being motivated to take action to address systemic racism because they're so concerned about making an error, about bringing it back to their feelings and how best to work with them, to calling out other white people on how they are. And certainly, while every Black person I know, everyone, has had to deal or experienced or noticed anti-Black racism, they have had to find ways to work around or through it, and in the process to understand their humanity and develop resilience, and to seek ways to address systemic racism or anti-Black racism. And that is what we need right now. That is the racial pandemic that we have to address. And it's within our grasp to educate and animate ourselves and our students because they see it. They're watching TV just like you. When they're not online doing your lessons, they're looking at the news or they're seeing things on their Twitter or Instagram. DiAngelo's approach is novel, yet traditional, since racism is primarily conceived of in her assessment as a personal prejudice. And absolutely, racism does exist on a personal basis. But racism is also structural and institutional. So in order to really help bring about transformation, a broader definition using racism to frame meaning and value as part of a democratic education is required. Frameworks need to be challenged, assumptions need to be unpacked in order to reframe race relations in order to have the cure for a racial pandemic. So self-reflection is important, but remember that racism is not only interpersonal, it is systemic. Okay, now I see I'm getting to my time here. I'm doing pretty good, I'm impressed. let's see if I can fly through some more, because I would love to take some of your questions. And I also want you to know that I was able to negotiate a bit of a discount for one of the books I have with my publisher that I will make Emily know about, and it will come up in one of my slides in a bit. Black history is seminal anti-Black racism work, for sure. Oh, I'm here, I'm good. So our obligation as educators is to entrust in our students the abilities to create conscious citizens who are vocal about examining their society. That's the book. That's how to get the discount if you're interested. And there's a teacher's guide, and there's also digital versions if you're interested. And I will be sending this on. And that's me, and I'm happy to take your questions. I did it on time.
You did it. That's awesome, Rosemary. Just fabulous information, and just so much to think of. I've got to be honest, from a previously teaching Canadian history, grade 7, 8, and 9, I'm embarrassed that
Didn't know?
I'm just learning about our Black history in Canada. So thank you for opening my eyes. If you want to stop sharing your screen, Rosemary, we'll get you on the big screen. There are questions coming in. Those of you watching, you will see you've got a Q&A button. So don't put your questions in the chat. That's too hard to pay attention to that. But you'll see over there is a Q&A, and we're going to get to as many questions as we can. One of the biggest questions, Rosemary, is those resources. You had so many things packed into that slide deck. Is that the resource everyone's going to get? What sort of resources can we expect to be able to send out to everyone?
What I created, I'm so sorry, I am all over the place here with the information, but I wanted to make sure that I gave you some books that I wanted you to read, a couple of films that I think that you should see, some that are appropriate for you personally, and because I'm not sure exactly what grades people are teaching, but for example, NFB has wonderful films that you should access, even though some of them are older, they're really good. And one that was created without any kind of wordage, it's called Black Soul, M. Noir. It's excellent, very short, and it's a great critical, small piece to get things moving, and you can use it with any grade. I also, I didn't include all of the items in the deck, but I did include, for example, one reference that has some of the charts that outline the nature of the population trends, which I think is important. I think it's just to, I didn't really get into it as much, but I think that sometimes in Quebec is a little bit different because you have the different language, the language issue. And I really did find myself wondering about, you know, how it is that my cousins growing up in Quebec never learned French, and I, growing up in Ontario, did learn French. And not extensive French. They're not fully bilingual like people are currently. And I think that part of it has to do with that cultural connection. But if people want some of the slides, let me know what's valuable to you, and I'll see what I can work out. But that isn't what I have prepared for you right now.
Oh, but that's great. And thank you. You posted your Twitter. I think you also had your Facebook link on your slide as well. Did you? I think we might have missed.
Yes, it's my name. I'm Rosemary Sadlier. And I would certainly be happy if people want to get in touch with me about anything, by all means, especially today while it's fresh in my mind, some of the things that might have been questions for you. But if you're interested in the book, I will definitely make sure that you get the discount information.
Excellent. Fabulous. All right. A few more questions here. Someone would like to do further research on the individual who is that first translator coming from Africa. They didn't catch his name.
Matthew da Costa. Matthew da Costa. And he was free. He was not enslaved. He could speak Mi'kmaq. He could speak French. He could speak Portuguese. He could speak the languages from West Africa. He was an effective contract negotiator. He's the subject of a Canada Post stamp from about 2 years ago. I was on the Canada Post Stamp Advisory Committee, and I was very pleased that they were willing to put him on a stamp. And I think that it's very important to keep in mind that he's the first African we have a name for. But there were Africans in the West, Africans in the New World very early on, in Middle America, in 800 AD. Remnants have been found in 1100 AD, and certainly they were with the Coureurs de Bois in the 1400s in this very land we're on now.
Perfect, excellent. Some other questions came in, and I know they were in the chat as well. Teachers are starting to implement anti-racism activities in their classrooms, which is absolutely fabulous. But others are asking, so what are some other things we can be doing as teachers to practice anti-racism?
I gave some in what I'm going to have available. Just some tips, basic things, like start the conversation. Start talking to your students about how they might feel if they were in a particular situation, what they're thinking about right now, what are some issues that are going on, what is fair, what is not fair, who is a Canadian, those basic kinds of questions, because of course I don't know what grades people are teaching, and be willing to hear the answers, and be open, and you know, I was open. I was sharing things with you that I haven't always shared in a public space because it doesn't always come up, but this particular topic was a framing to make that possible. I think that, you know, your own experiences, your recognition of your own privilege. You know, there's so many different ways to start, and please do get the resource that I will be providing to Emily.
Excellent, fabulous. And just so everyone knows, we'll send that resource over to QPAT. QPAT is going to send that out to you. I know some of you have said, we're not QPAT members, how do we get it? And you've posted your emails to us in the chat. So I'm sure we can find you and get that to you if you are not.
What I can do also, I guess I should post it on Facebook and post it on Twitter as well, post certain things so people can get in or know how to get in touch with me. But I think that understanding the historical inequities that have taken place in this country are very important. I was on Power and Politics and had to, in real time, address the reality that the Premier of Quebec and the Premier of Ontario in the same day both said there was no such thing as systemic racism. And I had to say, yes, there is. And I think that you have to say, yes, there is. But you have to understand why there is. And part of understanding why there is having a sense of what has gone on over time historically. It didn't just happen because somebody is mean. It happened, and it's so very well interwoven that sometimes it's not even seen.
And that was one of the questions that was also in the Q&A. So thank you for answering that about the Quebec saying there's no systemic racism. So thank you for that. Another question Rebecca asks, so she's an art teacher, but I think this applies to everyone, is how do we, you know, support anti-racism without it being cultural appropriation? So if we want to celebrate Black History Month, how do we avoid, you know, being seen as just appropriating, you know, culture in those ways?
I think, you know, the elephant in the room, is there a Black person involved? Is there a Black arts organization involved? If you're going to do something that, well, in art, is there a Black artist that you happen to know that you could bring in? And not that everybody who's Black knows everything about everything, no. But is there a Black arts organization that you could be working in conjunction with? Are there Black references? And this applies to every subject, really. Is there a way to bring in a subject expert, a community member, an organization that would be able to provide some assistance there? And the other part of that is to acknowledge, this is not my culture. This is not my authentic work, but I really like this because, and have your students reflect that back as well, and have them do some authentic work from their own backgrounds.
Right, so important. And yeah, fabulous. There are still some questions, but we are out of time. I do have all of the questions copied, Rosemary. I'll get them over to you, and perhaps, when we send out those resources, we can answer some of those questions that way too. But thank you so much. I'm not sure, Sebastian, if you are still here and want to sort of close things off.
Hi, Sebastian. Nice to see you.
Hi. I was there all along. Yes, I'm ready to be closer. First, I want to thank Rosemary for a very inspiring presentation, but I think a true eye-opener for everyone. I'm also a history teacher, taught Canadian history, and with an open mind and with addressing issues of discrimination and how we are presenting through the curriculum program and content Indigenous people, and how we're not talking much about Black history in Canada. But it's
sorry to interrupt, but isn't there a new curriculum piece being written right now?
Sorry, like that's what I want to address, because we've been as QPAT advocating for the past years actually to enhance the curriculum program, to enhance, to change the way we're portraying Indigenous people, for example, in our program. We have been successful, I would say partially, in having the program to change. It's very difficult. It's very cumbersome to get everyone to shift. Obviously, each history teacher has a responsibility to, on their own, to really present things in a different way. But we're still working on this, and certainly your presentation and the recent events gives us also more motivation to keep pushing. So that's will be our contribution. We also have a group, discussion group on the issue that was formed, and that's led by our president, Heidi Yetman. So I just want to, this is ongoing. This is going to be an ongoing conversation. It's a true eye opener. As I said, I agree that we will all need, as teachers and as union organization, to not only reflect, but also take action. And taking action is, for example, pushing for a better curriculum, not only in history, but across the board. And also to keep pushing these issues of discrimination within our organizations, and the systemic discrimination and racism, and the refusal from our premier to still today recognize that there's systemic racism, because I guess he doesn't understand what the definition is.
I don't think so.
Is really outrageous, and we will certainly at our level and keep pushing with, every time we meet politicians and ministers from this government about this. ID is meeting with the Minister of Education on Monday again, and we will keep meeting with him, and that's a way where we can address this issue and try to push. But it's quite difficult and difficult to understand why they would not even recognize that, because it is systemic, and it's not individual racism that we're tackling. It's also systemic, that within our institutions, and the lack of recognition makes it very, very difficult to take action. So thank you very much for your presentation. I think it was inspiring, and really truly appreciate, and I hope everyone appreciated also your presentation. And I'm sure a lot of teachers are on the ball right now and thinking how they will implement those issues within their classroom.
Merci bien. Thank you so much. I appreciated the opportunity to give some thought to the Quebec situation. And I am very happy to follow up with anybody I can. Maybe the questions, or whatever, if Facebook isn't the best way, to put it through QPAT, and they will get back to me. But thank you. I appreciate it. And I hope I really did give you something new to think about.
It's just a start. You set the table.
Good.
But that's perfect. Excellent. Well, thank you, everyone.